Welcome to our exploration of the Book of Lamentations. Have you ever wondered why this book is filled with so much sorrow and grief? Why is it included in the Bible, and what can we learn from it today? Stick with us till the end, and we'll uncover the significance of Lamentations and how its lessons still resonate in our lives. The Book of Lamentations is traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah and written around 586 BC after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Jeremiah witnessed the fall of Jerusalem firsthand and wrote these laments as an expression of his grief and the collective sorrow of the people. The book doesn't just reflect personal sorrow, it embodies the voice of a whole nation in mourning as they witness the destruction of their beloved city. It is a poetic and deeply emotional account, reflecting both the deep grief of the Israelites and their cries to God. Now, you might be wondering, how can a book that focuses so much on mourning and suffering hold any relevance for us today? Let's dive into the powerful messages of hope and faith that can be found in this book, even in the darkest of times. Lamentations is a book of 5 poems, each chapter written as an individual lament. The entire book is a heartfelt cry for mercy from God in the wake of Jerusalem's devastation. The Israelites had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Babylonians, and Jerusalem, their holy city, had been reduced to ruins. The book is set during a time of immense suffering for the people of Israel. Jerusalem's walls were destroyed, its temple was burned, and its inhabitants were either killed or taken captive. This was the result of years of disobedience to God's commands. The Book of Lamentations is a poetic and emotional reflection on the consequences of this sin and the profound sorrow that followed. Chapter 1, The Desolation of Jerusalem. In Chapter 1, the Book of Lamentations begins with a mournful tone as the author paints a sorrowful image of Jerusalem, once a proud city, now desolate. Jerusalem is personified as a grieving widow who has been left alone and abandoned, her beauty and glory stripped away. The writer speaks of the city's former joy, its streets filled with life, but now those streets are empty, the gates destroyed, and the people have been either killed or exiled. Jerusalem is crying out in despair. It remembers the days when it was the heart of the Jewish nation, a symbol of God's presence and favor. But now, the consequences of the nation's sins are on full display. The city's destruction is attributed to the people's rebellion against God, their rejection of His laws, and their worship of false idols. In this chapter, there's a deep sense of sorrow and regret, yet it also serves as a reflection on the justice of God, who allowed this devastation as a consequence of sin. Jeremiah, the poet of this lament, calls out for God's mercy, acknowledging the rightness of the judgment, but still pleading for compassion. The chapter encourages us to reflect on our own lives, to see the destructive power of sin, and to understand that while there are consequences, God is always just. It also points to the importance of turning to God even when we face the results of our own poor choices. Chapter 2, God's anger against His people. The second chapter delves even deeper into the theme of divine judgment. It begins with an exploration of God's anger toward Israel. The people of Israel had strayed from the path of righteousness, and now God's wrath has been poured out upon them. The chapter describes how God, once their protector, has become their adversary. It is as if God Himself has turned against His people in their disobedience. This chapter is heavy with images of destruction. God has torn down the walls of Jerusalem, burned the temple, and caused the city to become a place of ruin. The poet emphasizes the totality of the destruction, and there is a clear sense of God's holiness in this judgment. His anger is portrayed as just, as the people's sin had been allowed to grow unchecked for generations. While the people are suffering, the chapter serves as a sobering reminder that sin cannot go unpunished. Yet, even in God's anger, there is still the possibility of repentance. The author asks, "How long, O Lord?" showing a sense of longing for God to intervene with mercy and grace. This chapter reminds us that God's justice is always tied to His holiness, and while we face consequences for our actions, there is still hope if we turn to God with a humble heart. Chapter 3. A Cry for Mercy. Chapter 3 is often considered the emotional and theological heart of Lamentations. Unlike the previous chapters, which focus on the nation's collective suffering, this chapter is written in the first person. The author speaks from his own pain and anguish, identifying with the entire nation. His personal lament is vivid and raw, describing the physical and emotional torment he experiences as he feels overwhelmed by God's anger. However, even in the darkest of moments, the author expresses a deep hope. In the midst of his suffering, he remembers God's faithfulness and mercy. He acknowledges that even though he is facing severe consequences, God's love is steadfast. One of the most famous verses in this chapter, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end," is a beacon of hope amidst despair. This chapter highlights the tension between God's judgment and His mercy. While the author laments the agony he is experiencing, he also affirms that God will restore what has been lost. The chapter gives us a model for processing suffering. It doesn't deny the reality of pain, but it challenges us to look beyond the pain to the hope of God's mercy and faithfulness, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Chapter 4. The Consequences of Sin. In Chapter 4, the author takes a step back to reflect on the social and communal consequences of Israel's sin. The chapter describes in graphic detail the horrors that the people of Jerusalem are facing. It speaks of the suffering of children, the destruction of the city's wealth, and the collapse of the very fabric of society. The imagery is stark, painting a picture of a society that has crumbled under the weight of sin and disobedience. One of the key points in this chapter is the failure of Israel's leaders, prophets, priests, and kings. These figures were supposed to lead the people in righteousness and guide them back to God, but instead they failed. Their sin and negligence contributed to the fall of Jerusalem. This chapter serves as a powerful reminder that leadership matters, and when leaders fail to uphold God's truth, the consequences are far-reaching. Despite the grim portrayal of sin's effects, the chapter ends with a glimmer of hope. While the people of Israel have faced destruction, the author ends with a reflection on God's sovereignty. Even in the midst of the darkest times, God is still in control, and there is still a possibility for restoration. Chapter 5. A Prayer for Restoration. The final chapter of Lamentations is a heartfelt prayer for restoration. After reflecting on the depth of Israel's suffering, the author turns to God in a desperate plea for mercy. He asks God to remember the misery of His people and to restore them. The chapter is filled with a sense of longing for a return to the days of God's favor. This chapter serves as both a confession of Israel's sin and a request for God to bring healing. The people are aware of their wrongdoing, but they also know that God is their only hope for recovery. The chapter expresses a profound trust that, despite everything, God will not abandon His people. The author pleads for God to renew His covenant with them and to restore the joy and peace that had been lost. As the book concludes, the tone shifts to one of humility and faith. The final words of the chapter leave the question hanging in the air. Will God restore His people, or has He forever rejected them? This unanswered question leaves the reader in suspense, yet it also emphasizes the theme of faith and hope, believing that, despite the situation, God will act in His perfect timing. To sum it up, what can we learn from the Book of Lamentations? Despite the overwhelming sorrow and grief expressed throughout the book, there is an underlying message of hope. Lamentations teaches us that While sin has consequences, God's mercy is far greater. It calls us to acknowledge our mistakes, to mourn the brokenness around us, but also to trust in God's ability to restore and heal. The Book of Lamentations is not just a book about sorrow. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, God's faithfulness remains. No matter how far we've fallen, we can always return to Him for restoration. So, what has the story of Lamentations taught you? How does this journey of faith relate to your life today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found something meaningful today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.